Welcome back to Fuel's Spark User Summit on Implementing Zero Trust. Our next speaker is Tim Woods, VP of Technology Alliances from Firemon. Tim brings more than 20 years of security experience to his role as VP of Technology Alliances at Firemon. His global engagements have given him great insights across virtually every market sector and enterprises of all sizes. Tim believes his most important task is education and raising awareness to build strong organizational security postures. According to Tim, fighting complacency and security should be everyone's top priority if we are to win the war on cybercrime. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tim. Tim, we can't hear you.
How about now? There we go.
Now we can hear you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank everybody for being here. I know you could be doing 1,000 other things, but you chose to spend your time with us today. And for that, we are very appreciative. So thank you. I'll be trying to monitor the Q&A chat over here as we're going through here. So if you have questions, but if not, if you want to save them to the end, we'll try to address them there. I'm going to try to leave enough time that we'll answer any questions that you might have as well as we go through this. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn my mug off right now, so not distracting you guys. Hopefully you're familiar with Firemon, but you may not be, and that's fine if you're not. Everyone loves a good story, and Firemon has a great story. Our story goes back, oh my goodness, almost 20 years, over 20 years that we've been helping companies, I'm sure pretty much like your own, get their arms around, policy management and security of their policies and the hygiene of their policies and managing change. And of course, we've moved into cloud. Who hasn't moved into cloud security operations, and then also cybersecurity asset management. So situational awareness and getting your arms. This ties neatly into zero trust because, one of the first steps, and we're going to talk about this as we get a little deeper into the presentation. One of the first steps in implementing a zero trust network architecture, of course, is classifying what it is that you have. The discovery portion of it, which is so critically important. But we're going to focus predominantly here on security policy management and how that kind of parlays into zero trust. There's a lot of areas. We'll touch on those different areas. But since we have complexity in the title, I wanted to kind of put some walls around that complexity, so to speak. Complexity, and as you heard in my introduction there, the complacency piece of it, because complacency is kind of complexity's running partner. Is complexity's best friend is complacency. And of course, when you get complexity and you get complacency running together, they're very strong enablers for bad actors, which is unfortunate for us when we allow that to happen. So we have to challenge complexity within our environments. And I drew this little chart out here, this simple little chart out here to the right. I first created this kind of to show just kind of the rise in rules, the sheer volume of rules over time within an environment, and that the resources necessary to manage that volume, that volume increase, did not kind of stay in lockstep with it. And so we had this complexity gap that kind of developed over time. And so there once upon a time where it was not unusual to see a firewall with 200, 300 rules, 400 rules. I remember when I saw my first firewall that had 1,500 rules in it. I'm like, oh my God, how could you have a firewall with it? How could you possibly need 1,500 rules? And now it's not unusual to see firewalls with 10,000 rules, 20,000 rules, 30,000 rules. And then you multiply that by the total number of enforcement devices, because it's not just firewalls anymore, right? I mean, it's routers and switches and SD-WAN devices, and all of these things have security enforcement policies, policy enforcement type access control lists in them that you need to manage. The good news about having all of these policies spread out across your hybrid infrastructure is we can use these to leverage as it relates to zero trust. And you could apply this chart to many different things. It's, I'm talking about the sheer volume of rules, and that's a big one that has continued to go up over time. But there's other things as well. It's when applications get deployed within the environment outside of the purview of security. It's when we put data sets out there and we fail to encrypt them. Could be just a misconfiguration. It's application sprawl. And you'll see my take on that here in a little bit too, as we look about those, as we talk about those things that get put into our environments and outside of the purview. I feel so bad for some of you guys. You guys are my heroes. Some of you IT security folks out there, professionals, are my heroes, because I feel like you have your hands tied behind your back and a blindfold on sometimes, but you're being asked to secure these things that are going into the environment. And you can't see them. You're not aware of them. And so that's a big thing. And it brings me into my next step about how important visibility is. Visibility is not just to security and to compliance, but also as it relates to zero trust. You know, one of the biggest things that we hear, I don't care in our surveys, when I'm talking to new and climate engagements and clients, whether we're at an event or a trade show or questions within a virtual context of a webinar like we're doing today, but it comes up over and over and over again. List number one, it's the concern for the lack of visibility I have within my environment. It's not the only one. As you can see here, there are other things, and all of these can represent inhibitors or barriers to a good, successful zero trust implementation. But visibility kind of ranks at the top. When we don't have visibility, when we don't have good insight, when we don't have good holistic vision across our hybrid infrastructure that's continuing to expand, then the problems kind of cascade from there. I listed just a few of the visibility challenges that you run into when you have that lack of visibility. And of course, you could probably, these are just the ones that I came up with. I'm quite sure you could put your own bubbles out here. But change, you know, when a change happens, I truly believe that you need to be able to, when a change happens, not only detect that change, but answer some very basic questions about that change. You know, did I expect the change? Did the change have a negative impact? How do you analyze the impact of that change? Did it have a negative impact on my security posture, my business posture, my compliance posture, et cetera? And that gets us into hygiene, it gets us into risk, it gets us into complexity. But when you lack that visibility, these are some of the things that can crop up. And know when I talk about complexity, I'm not talking about the inherent complexity that you would expect in a good security implementation. I'm talking about that unnecessary complexity that creeps into the equation over time. You know, when I talked about those policies earlier, when I said I see a policy that has 10,000 rules or 20,000 rules in it, or even more, I recently saw one, very recently here, saw a policy that had over 50,000 rules in it. It was a new engagement. And when we looked at the complexity of that policy, when we looked at some of the, we'll just call it what it is, the bloat that was in that policy. And this is not uncommon over the years. I've been at Firemon for a little over 13 years. It's not uncommon to see 30, 40, even 50% unused rules in a policy that big. In this particular policy, we saw almost 40% unused. That was shadowed rules, redundant rules, duplicate rules, overly permissive things within this policy that could be cleaned up. And so that's the type of complexity that I'm talking about, this unnecessary complexity that we put on ourselves that creeps into the equation over time when we're not vigilant about managing the hygiene of our security policies across our environment. Practical example here. This is just a snapshot from our security manager dashboard, mini dash. We have mini dashboards within the product. But when I talk about having a holistic view, this is just one of the policy dashboards that gives me, across all of the different devices that I'm monitoring, it gives me a good idea about what my hygiene looks like. So I can see those redundant objects. I can see those redundant rules. I can see those unreferenced networks objects. I can see where they're at. But more importantly, it gives me the actionable intelligence that I can use to build a remediation around so that I can start attacking that unnecessary complexity that I know is going to hamper my zero trust network implementation over time. So complexity, we have to challenge it. speed, the business has in many ways accelerated, and I hear this a lot too, the business has accelerated past my ability to consistently honor their requests or consistency meet the demands for the speed of their requests. And of course, we know what happens there whenever if security represents a speed bump, or if security represents a stopping point, then the business looks for a way to go around us. And that's something that we can't afford. And of course, compliance always looms large. And when I talk about compliance, it's not just for you guys out there that are in an organization that has compliance, regulatory compliance mandates. Even if you don't have a mandatory compliance mandate, you're still going to have your own best practice, right? You're still going to want to, when a change happens, assess that change against your best practice to make sure that somebody isn't violating something that you would never want to happen within your environment. Opening up a clear text protocol from the inside to the outside, or the outside to the inside, or whatever it happens to be. You want to be able to assess that change to make sure that somebody hasn't caused an impact to business continuity, or worse yet, opened up a hole that could represent, significant risk to the environment. So this whole presentation here, if you don't take anything away, take these three little kind of tidbits here away as kind of a guiding principle. If you can't see it, you can't secure it. And if you can't manage it, if you can't see it, you can't manage it. If you can't manage it, you can't secure it. And of course, if you can't secure it, you're definitely not going to be able to trust it, right? And so it's kind of a litmus, right, against anything that you have out there. It's like, do I have the ability to manage this particular asset, resource, application, device, or individual effectively? And if I don't, then we know what's going to fall in line after that. But kind of a good watermark. And as I said, there's other key elements to zero trust: the workloads, the devices, the data, the people. We're focusing on predominantly the network piece of it here today. We're going to touch on identity access management. I'll touch on data, some of these other ones here, but we could spend a whole session on any one of these individually in their own lane to talk about, how zero trust is applied to these areas as well. I drew a little diagram here to try to represent kind of what the hybrid infrastructure looks like today. And like I said, it is a simple illustration, but I believe that a successful zero trust strategy has to extend, across the entirety of the hybrid infrastructure, that whole service. And we need to be able to leverage the existing security devices and the enforcement policies that we have out there. We see this kind of pervasive growth of security policies across this expanded hybrid surface. But unfortunately, what I also see is that we either unknowingly or sometimes knowingly, and when I say that, I don't mean that as a jab or anything, but I hear a lot, from the people that I engage with. It's like, Tim, it's not that I don't know what to do. It's not that our people don't know what to do. It's having the time and the resources and the cycles to do it. And so that's what I mean by knowingly. It's like, I know that needs to be done, but I've got 15 priority ones on my plate and I can get to 2 of them. And guess what? Those priorities shift next week because I have some new ones that come on board. And so so what happens is we push some things to the side, and sometimes that results in security gaps. But so we don't adequately address the required hygiene needed. Somebody said, yes, I feel this. We don't adequately address the required hygiene needed to effectively, for the necessary policy management that we know is out there. And so what happens is this lack of hygiene is definitely going to come back to bite us. It's going to grow that security debt over time, but it's also going to impact the desired results of implementing a zero trust architecture, using those network security controls. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of vendor technology, a lot of heterogeneity in those environments. And of course, we want to be able to leverage that where we can. So where do we start? Where do we go, or where do we start from first? Of course, it is surveying the estate. It's understanding, what do I have? it's not just good, it's almost going back to, you know, layers in defense, but it's understanding what is it that I have that somebody would want and to what extent would they go to get it. But also it's understanding what I have within my environment, classifying the importance of that information. Again, those assets, those resources, those applications, that data, and to what extent would somebody try to go to get it, which is going to dictate how much security I have to throw at this, how much defenses I have to build around this in order to adequately protect it, both inside and outside. It's no longer just a, you know, and I've seen a lot of fragmentation over time, over the last few years between, you know, for what I would call a traditional IT security group may not necessarily be the same group of individuals that's taking responsible for securing some of the cloud assets and some of the other assets, you know, as we look along the path that we traverse from the ground to the cloud. And so I've seen stakeholders, I've seen DevOps, I've seen even the business owners themselves takes responsibility for securing their own cloud implementations. And I've seen that result in not so positive results sometimes as well. I've seen it, you know, kind of backfire. And it's not that they're not incredibly smart people. They're incredibly smart people, but they just may not be well grounded from a security stance. And so mistakes are made. But what happens, what I mainly see, the bigger issue that I see arising out of this is we're not singing from a centralized security doctrine anymore. We're not taking a holistic look at our security across the entire environment, as maybe we once did when it was just our data centers, corporate offices, and our remote offices. Now that we, you know, the borders, what we would have considered a perimeter, you know, has greatly blurred. But the amount of individuals that are taking responsibility for the security of that has somewhat fragmented as well. So I've seen some of that. Establishing zones of control, and a zone of control. A zone of control could be a workload, it could be a workstation, or it could be a group of servers. It could be anything. When we talk about segmentation or micro-segmentation, using network security controls, I mean, that's really what we're talking about. Again, a practical example here, one of the things that we do is we build a zone matrix that allows you kind of to define what your zones are, and then which zones can talk to which zones, destination and source zones, but then also the policies that control what is allowed for that interzone communication, and then being able to interrogate that policy as change happens. So again, goes back to visibility, it goes back to understanding change. When a change happens, I want to make sure that that change hasn't had a negative impact on the boundaries that I've defined for my zones of control. So we need to be able to assess that. We need to be able to assess that change. And that can happen both reactively or proactively or on demand. And so there's different layers there too. When I say proactively, I'm really talking about assessing a proposed approved change. And this is important. This is an important piece to understand. It's running an assessment against a proposed change in the context of the policy that it's destined for. It doesn't do me a lot of good to run an assessment against just that change while it's standing alone by itself. I have to understand the behavior of the policy that it's going to go into so that I understand how it interrelates. And so doing that, kind of sandboxing that policy and then running my best practice assessment, my HIPAA assessment, my FISMA assessment, my PCI assessment, my whatever it happens to be, NERC, SIP, NIST, whatever it happens to be, whatever the assessment happens to be, I want to run against this proposed change so that I know proactively in advance if that change is going to have a negative impact toward my security posture or my compliance posture, business continuity, et cetera. So being able to do that, but then reactively too. Sometimes a change happens, even if the change wasn't planned, there's an ad hoc change or something takes place. I want to make sure that I can still assess those types of change, especially if we think something nefarious could be taking place, right? We want to be able to detect that when it happens. And I want to be able to track those. I want to be able to track those control failures when a control failure to a when an assessment runs and there are control failures, typically what happens is there's multiple control failures. When we experience one failure, we experience multiple failures, but being able to categorize those, use that metadata to put in the context of the policies and the rules themselves so that you can build remediation. I'll give you an example of that in just a minute, but you want to be able to track all of those control failures and understand the severity of those individual control failures as it relates to the environment overall as well. So this is one of the things, and I'm going to apologize right now because I know this, I didn't really mean to get into the nitty gritty of the screenshot here. This is just mainly for you to take away later. But you can see here some of these, the red and the orange and the yellow and stuff. This is some embedded metadata here. If I was to click on this, if I was actually in the tool, then I can see that this particular rule has 15 critical control failures, probably unacceptable in anybody's environment. But if I was to click on this little red 15 here, it would actually take me inside that rule to the device, to the policy, and it would show me exactly what those 15 critical failures were. So very quickly, I can get down to the source of the failure so that I can create that remediation that I need to do to correct that. Very important. Identity and access management. I am just going to touch on this. Again, this is one of those areas we could spend an entire session on for sure. And I'm not going to trivialize it either, because identity access management is an important, very important part, critical part of zero trust. Very important, especially as we get into cloud. Identifying the user and making sure that that user is the person that we believe it is, making sure that the device that they're connecting to the network is validated and it has everything on it that it needs. And then understanding what is the resource that they're trying to get to, and then making sure that once we give them trust to that resource, you know, what is the persistence of that trust? So at some point we have to go back and revalidate that again too. You know, as it relates to the trust that we're giving them. So once you let somebody inside the building, it doesn't mean that they have free run to every piece of all the data sources that you have. There's still, again, this is where zones of control come into play as well, as well as the ways that you can both authenticate and authorize access to the resources that are contained within the infrastructure. And that's where least privilege comes into play. I'm an old salt. You guys that have heard me speak before, maybe some of you have, you know, we had an old saying, we had a saying in the Navy, in the Naval Security Group, it was loose lips sink ships. And we were only given access to data that we had. You know, I had a top secret security clearance, but that didn't mean that I got, hey, wow, let's go look at all the top secret information. You had access to the information that you had a need to know for. And if you didn't have a need to know, then you didn't have access to that information. And so when we look at the policies on an enforcement point and we find these inadvertent access or overly permissive rules that makes these overly permissive rules that have little to no contextual documentation, it's the exact opposite of what we're trying to achieve with zero trust, right? Overly permissive rules can provide way more access than what is necessary to meet the needs of the business. And so we want to be able to lock those. And how does that happen? Sometimes it happens when we're troubleshooting, right? Probably anybody that's managed a firewall before, you know that if you're trying to get an application up and running and it's not working and you're trying to figure out what the ports are that it's using. And then it's like, well, let me see, I'm going to put this any rule in here and hey, look, everything is working. Okay, now I can troubleshoot, but at least the business owner has the access to the information that they need if I've solved their problem. And sometimes we leave those rules there and they kind of take on a life of their own until they come back to bite us in the shoe later. So, which is not a good thing. And that's why documentation is so important, but it's also why it's so important to be able to surface those overly permissive rules so that we can tighten them up so that they can restrict access to the information that is needed. Somebody said, what makes a rule have a control failure? It could be a number of different things. It could be somebody enabling an object, you know, to to a zone as that represents a zone failure. Maybe I don't allow a particular protocol, or maybe it's a clear text. I gave the example earlier of a clear text. Maybe somebody enabled, SNMP for a zone, and we don't allow SNMP, or we only allow SNMP v3. But somebody made a change to a rule that violated when we run our assessment, then our assessment is going to catch that. And an assessment, and so I'll back up for just a second, and not to get too far into the weeds again, but an assessment could be one control check, or it could be 500 to 600 control checks. But the most important thing to understand is that every time a change happens, I can run as many assessments against that change, that change rule as I want to. One of the things that we do at Firemon is when a change happens, when we detect a change, is we actually do a differential comparison between the old policy to the new policy, not only to understand the change, but to give you the who, the what, the when, the where, all the details of that change. And then we run the assessment against it to see if there's any control failures. And again, that control failure could be somebody enabling a protocol. It could be somebody putting in a source range or a destination range that is too broad in nature. It could be somebody that put in something that overlapped another rule that caused an impact to a rule below it, and caused an impact to the business. One of the first things that you ask, right, anytime that there's an impact to the business, is what changed. And all too frequently, nobody wants to raise their hand as far as what changed. But when you have visibility to changes within your environment, when you could detect a change and you analyze that change, then you don't need anybody to raise their hands. You know what changes have been made and what is and therefore you can track to see if that particular change, of course, caused an impact to the business. So tracking changes is critically important. Again, another practical screenshot here. I'm just showing you here. This is one way we have an assessment that or a report we can run that's called a complexity report, and we can establish, and we monitor this all the time dynamically. But we look at the complexity of a device, and what I'm really talking about there is I'm looking at how open a particular device is. And typically, what I'll find when I find an overly complex device, what that typically means is I have some overly permissive rules. Well, then I can dig down into the policy deeper to find the actual rules that are contributing to that complexity score. And that's usually where that's where I will surface I will find that overly permissive rule that is embedded within that policy. True story. I was at a client's location one day. They were evaluating the platform, and the complexity score came up, and they said, "Now, what does this mean? We have two items up here, two devices that are in the red." And I said, that's a very high complexity score against that rule. And we dug down into it and come to find out they had two rules that they'd put in there for troubleshooting that essentially negated the entire effectiveness of that firewall. They shut the meeting down right then and there to go correct that mistake, to fix that rule. So true story, happened. And so as we're talking about, rules and using those rules, another big asset that you have at your disposal, of course, is the richness of the policies today. With the advent of the next generation firewall, we no longer have just source, destination, and port. We now have source, destination, port. We have content ID, user ID, application ID. We can really build some robust rules. The only cautionary tale I would add to that would be that we have to be honest with ourselves too. If we didn't do a good job of managing source, destination, and service, how are we, if we didn't do a good job of monitoring 3 tuples of information, how are we going to do a good job of managing 6 tuples of information? So again, it gets back to understanding the hygiene of the policy, the behavior of the policy, having visibility to the behavior of that policy. And you can't do it manually anymore. It is impossible to manually understand the complete behavior of a policy because of the size that these policies have become and the inherent complexity that some of these policies have. And so you need some way to automate the analysis and the behavior of those policies. So how do you monitor the device changes in terms of PA is sending its config to Firemon, or is Firemon the controller? No, that's a great question, and I'll go ahead and address that. I'll try to do a good job of addressing that really quick. We monitor the log output, so we're looking for change. We parse the logs real time. I'm not looking at the data load. I'm parsing the logs real time, and I'm looking for several different things. As I'm parsing the data logs, I'm looking for anything that would be indicative of change, anything that would be an indicator of change. And when I detect that change, that's going to be my trigger. And I will go and initiate a retrieval. Without getting too far down, there's three components. There's a data controller, there's an application server, there's a database, but it's the data controller will actually go out and initiate a retrieval. We'll bring that back, and then we'll do that differential comparison of the policies to determine what the change is, and then give you that who, that what, when, where, all the details of the change. But now that I have a fresh copy of that policy, that freshly modified policy, now I can run my assessments against that policy as well. So hopefully that helps in answering your question there. But everything we do is real time. And it's not just looking for change. We're also extracting a great deal of telemetry out of the data as well. We're looking at hit counts against rules, hit counts against objects. We're looking at who's talking to who, any type of route intelligence that we can extract or derive from the log information as we parse it real time. Then we use that to build dynamic network maps and give you a depiction of the topology. And then we use that topology so we can do really cool things like, you know, how do I get from point A to point B, and what enforcement points are along the way that would either allow that access or things that are blocking that access. So if you've ever tried to enable a new rule across an environment to enable a business application, and you're using traceroute, and you're using telnet, and you're using whatever you can to try to understand what is in scope across that path so that you can enable the business. So you have to know what enforcement points are along there that you may have to modify. One of the biggest technologies that you can help to bring into your kind of arsenal, of course, is trying to use automation, using automation as it applies to zero trust. And again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. I hear it a lot. You know, I know what I need to do. I just don't have the time to do it. Or I hear I've got my best people doing a lot of the most reoccurring, repetitive, mundane tasks, and I need to be able to free them up to focus on some of the higher skilled activities that they were brought in to do, and or train some of the other people. My top tier doesn't even have time, doesn't have the cycles to invest in some of the other individuals that we have in the group. And so it's a really vicious circle. But this is where automation can come into play. Being able to automate, identify those areas, that low-hanging fruit where you know that you have inconsistent results. There's nothing worse than pushing out a change, especially if it's a vetted change, you know, at 3 a.m. in the morning or 2 a.m. in the morning, just to find out that it causes an impact, and then you're having to back the change out and then go in to troubleshoot it, you know. So being able to have more consistency across that change process by using automation is one of the first places that I look for. And this is going to help as you install your zero trust access rules, and as you kind of redefine how you're using some of your enforcement policies, maybe at a more discrete level and less and more granular, then you're going to want to be able to ensure that those policies remain intact. And you're not going to have the time, again, to go back and manually interrogate those every time a change takes place. And therefore, that's an area where automation can help a great deal. There's so many benefits. We'll list some of those here in a minute. Real quick, this particular screen, if this little diagram looks familiar to you, it's because I took it directly from NIST. What I did here is, or what we did is we tried to overlay where some of the network security policy management platform functionality blends into the NIST Zero Trust Architecture Guideline. And I've listed that for you there, special publication 800-207. But you can see whether it's the continuous device monitoring, compliance, threat intelligence, log ingestion, policy enforcement detection, et cetera, you can kind of see the different areas where we kind of overlay some of the network security policy management functionality very quickly. So, and then you see over to the right there too. Let me go back there just a second. I think it's important to note, I'll touch on this again in a second, but you can see where there's some, where we talk about SIM and SOAR and XDR. I'll hit on that in just a second also. But maintaining a zero trust posture, again, being able to analyze change when change happens, being able to leverage automation to do that automatically and continuously every time a change happens can just work wonders for your environment and maintaining better consistency across your environment. But it can have a positive impact on your compliance, positive impact on meeting the needs of the business, reducing misconfigurations. Here's one thing I know for sure, guys, and I promise you this: if you don't challenge complexity within your environments, the probability of human error and the probability of risk and the probability of misconfiguration is only going to go up. Complexity in an environment, unnecessary complexity within an environment doesn't go away. It only gets larger. That complexity gap continues to expand. And so you have to challenge it. And one way to do that is implementing automation. So that you do free up the cycles in the day and give your people more time to focus on things that are even more important to the business. I think Gartner uses this quote every year, right? Consequences of ignoring security policies. Through 2023, 99% of firewall breaches will be caused by misconfigurations, not firewall. They're talking about human error. You know, it's code word for misconfiguration is code word for human error there. But the sad point about it is it is true. And so whether it's impacting compliance, or if you've been on the unfortunate end of receiving a fine, you know, that can bring greater inspection upon how we're securing our environments. Staffing costs, again, I haven't talked to anybody that says that they have too many resources. We still have this security gap, this skills gap, this people gap that we're fighting with as well. And of course, the pandemic has definitely not helped any of that. One of the some of the goals of an effective network security policy management platform is to help you reduce risk. It's to help you give that real-time visibility that you need holistically across the entire environment, manage change so that when change happens, you are able to answer those questions. You know, did I expect the change? Did the change cause any negative impacts to my compliance, my business posture, my security posture, and being able to enforce compliance? I would never want to put myself in a position where compliance was a fire drill every time we needed an audit, right? I want to put myself in a continuous compliance posture so that every time a change happens, I'm inspecting that for for any type of compliance violations, so that we can get on top of them, you know, immediately. So one of the things that we're big on is understanding that every environment is different, and the scale of some of these hybrid environments nowadays they're just huge, and they're continuing to grow. The technology that you deploy to use, you know, has to be able to help you. It has to scale to the size of the environment. It doesn't matter how good the technology, it doesn't matter who the technology is from. It doesn't matter if it's the latest technology on the planet. If it does not scale to the size of the environment, you're not going to see the return on the security investment that you're looking for, and it's not going to be adopted. And so it has to scale. I believe everything today has to be done in real time. It has to be customizable to the environment as well. You need integrated search. It has to be, we use Elasticsearch and stuff in ours, so you have almost instantaneous results. And then last, but certainly not least, and probably this should have been first, is the technology that you're deploying within your environments today, especially as it relates to zero trust, should have a very robust API the ability to exchange information, whether you're using it today or not. I promise you in the future you will want that ability. 1 + 1 should always equal more than 2, but I want to be able to raise the total value of my combined security solutions. So here's a quick picture of it. We play in the cloud, we play on premise, SD-WAN. These are where the policies are at. We have ties into SIEM and SOAR. We have an incredibly robust API that we expose. One of our, Palo is one of our premier technology alliance partners, very strong integration with the Palo ecosystem. Guys, if you think we could help you in one of these given areas, if you're struggling with visibility, if you're struggling with getting your arms around complexity, we would love to talk to you and help in any way that we can. So I've got about 5 minutes. I wanted to leave us just a little bit more time. Can you briefly touch on, but we'll go ahead and answer some questions here right quick. No issue on sysadmin. Yes, even if you use the application itself. Yes. Can you briefly touch on licensing? It's typically done by security enforcement point. Firemon has a very flexible deployment model. It virtualizes quite well, so I can deploy in the cloud. I can deploy on-prem. If you want to use a purpose-built appliance, you can do that. Traditional data center type stuff. Predominantly, we are deployed virtually as a virtual instance, either as an AMI or a VM or something like that. It distributes, like I said earlier. You can have a unified deployment, or you can have a very distributed deployment where you can have multiple data collectors going back to clustered application servers, going back to a clustered database, if that's what your environment dictates. So it can scale to any size environment. So it virtualizes quite well. But yeah, it's typically done on a subscription basis per firewall. Is there support? Here's a side question. Is there support for ServiceNow? As I said, we have a very robust API. ITSM is one of the big ones. You want to be able to integrate. We clearly recognize we are not the center of the universe. We want to tie into your universe and give you the benefit of the functionality that a network security policy management platform brings you, and tie that into the systems that you're using, systems of trust that you're using, such as your ServiceNow ITSM. So, for example, to give you kind of a constructive view of that, it would be your IT security personnel could create their rules, manage the rules, approve the rules, assess the rules, all on the Firemon Security Manager platform, and that could automatically build the tickets and populate whatever the change control tickets are up into the ServiceNow, and then so that information can be bidirectionally exchanged dynamically. But what you're trying to get away from, and where you're trying to save cycles, is you should never have to jump to multiple systems to put the same information in 3 different places or 2 different places. You should be able to put it in one place, and then that information should be populated accordingly to where it needs to go. How do you detect change? I kind of went over that. That was the rule log monitor, real-time rule ingestion. Do you have support for AWS? Yes, we have support for AWS, support for Azure, support the VPCs and network security groups. Absolutely. What else? How is it implemented? That's it. Any other questions? I'm going to finish up on time here, guys. So if there's not any other questions, I'm just going back very quickly here to see if there was anything that I missed. Somebody said apps and threats are dynamic. I don't understand. Why would you create a dynamic config? Yes, when firewalls become dynamic, configuration misconfiguration can happen even after proper configurations. It can, depending on the environment. We do also, one of the other things, or one of the other telemetry that we bring to bear on the surface of the problem is being able to ingest vulnerability scan data, and then using that to see how that vulnerability scan data translates to kind of the security policy. So in other words, is there any rules in my policy that are called out in a particular CVE or something like that, so if I have some overly risky rules or high ports or something like that that's called out in a CVE very quickly, then that's something that I would want to understand. Sorry, Tim, I really don't understand how Firemon integrates. How can it tell what or shouldn't be there in a firewall rule, or surely on the sysops knows what or shouldn't be operated as Firemon of a SIM or for a firewall. Firemon, so I'm out of time here, so I'll try to address this last question. Firemon supports it can support a firewall, switches, routers, load balancers. We send information. We're not a SIM. We're sending. So the log information, when I ingest that log data, I'm using that in order to properly manage the actual firewall policies themselves. I'm not keeping that data. So I'm not trying to be a SIM, although I can send information to the SIM. I can even receive information from your SIM. Like you may already be sending your firewall logs to a SIM. Then you want to forward, redirect, or reflect that information back to me, and I could parse that instead of parsing it directly from the firewall enforcement point itself. So how do I know if it's a bad policy? Because I'm going to analyze that policy. So that's where your assessments come into play. That's where your best practices. We can find the little stuff. So we can technical mistakes in a policy. What's a technical mistake? A shadowed rule, a redundant rule, any rules that go into a policy that are duplicated, that absolutely are never going to get hit. They serve no purpose for being in that policy. That would be a technical mistake. That's a math exercise. I can figure that out on day one, on day zero. But things over time, as we look over time, we also analyze the usage of the policies or usage of the rules over time. And so over time, you're only going to get better. I can find the rules that are being used the most, the rules that are being used the least. And more importantly, I can find those rules that aren't being used at all. And then again, I want to be able to, I'll tell you this, the better you make use of the assessments. In other words, if you take the time to build your assessments to run against your policies, if you put the time up front, and there's not a lot of, we have pre-built assessments out of the box, many of them for all the major regulatory compliance initiatives. But if you take the time to kind of personalize that for your needs, it's going to pay you back tenfold. Every time a change happens, every time a change is made, you're going to be able to assess that change against your own best practices, against those requirements, against those regulatory compliance initiatives that you're responsible for. It will just continue. It's the love. I like to call it the love that keeps on giving. So anyway, guys, I'm out of time. I want to thank you for your time today. Feel free to give me, send me a direct email or reach out to us directly. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have or talk to you one-on-one. tim.woods@firemon.com, or just visit us at firemon.com. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Tim. We really appreciate you being here with us today and sharing your insights with the Fuel community. So just to wrap up our event for today, there's a few updates to share. Everyone can see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so some of our upcoming events. On the 24th, there is a virtual chapter meeting in Minnesota. This event is listed on the Fuel homepage, so anyone's welcome to register and attend. We also have a webinar coming up on March 1st with Keysight around the expandable next generation security for Zero Trust Enterprise. So we encourage you to register and attend that as well. And finally, I would ask you keep an eye out for an email with a link to this survey. We would love your feedback on today's event, just so we can continue to improve and serve the Fuel community. So thank you all so much. Have a great day.